It was a gray afternoon in Akron, Ohio, when a patrol officer radioed in a line that froze everyone on the channel. Seems like a body part. The words came from behind a weather-worn house on a narrow dead-end street, a house neighbors had long stopped noticing. In the small backyard stood a shallow fire pit, ringed by cinder blocks, filled with ash and scraps of melted plastic. A detective knelt beside it, brushing away the soot with the tip of a gloved hand. Beneath the layer of burned debris, something pale and solid had begun to surface. At first it looked like nothing, just the root of a tree, maybe an old piece of pipe. But the longer they looked, the more unmistakable it became. A curve of bone, the faint shape of a knee joint, the sickening, human kind of shape that never belongs in a backyard. A soft rain began to fall, turning the dirt to mud. Officers stepped back, calling for the medical examiner and forensic team. And from the edge of the yard, a woman's voice broke through the static of radios and the rustle of plastic sheeting. "Is it her? Please, is it her?" It was Kim Freitag, the missing woman's daughter. For 30 days, Kim had begged the police to look here. For 30 days, she'd been dismissed, told her mother was probably just off her meds again. Now the smell of burnt soil filled the air, and every instinct in Kim's body told her she was standing above her mother's grave. Hours earlier, Kim had received an anonymous message. If he was going to get rid of someone, he'd bury them in the backyard. The text came from an unrecognized number, no name, no context. But she didn't hesitate. She called the police herself and drove straight to her mother's house, the same house she'd visited again and again, begging officers to break in, insisting something terrible had happened inside. This time they listened. As officers taped off the yard, one detective turned to Kim with a clipboard. "I need your consent to search the property," he said quietly. Kim signed her name with trembling hands. "Do whatever you have to do." The first shovel struck ground at 4:22 p.m. Inside the shallow pit, the soil was black and clumped with melted bedding fibers. Within minutes, they uncovered the edge of a plastic bag. Fused of fabric, melted into strange folds. When they pulled it back, the outline of a human arm appeared. Even the seasoned detectives went silent. The medical examiner crouched beside the pit. The rope was still tied around the neck. The skin bore the marks of fire. Beneath the burns was a fracture, blunt force trauma, unmistakable. This wasn't just a burial. It was rage, deliberate and personal. For weeks, the name on every missing person bulletin had been Martha Robin Freitag, age 53, reported missing by her daughter Kim. She lived here with her boyfriend, David Callahan, the same man police had spoken to multiple times, and the same man Kim had warned them about from the very beginning. She had told them, "If I come up missing or dead, it is no accident. He told me he'd make sure nobody ever found me." They had written it down. And then they left. As crime scene technicians photographed the backyard, officers at the station were already preparing the paperwork. A name appeared on the warrant. David Callahan, 53 years old. He was already in county jail, not for murder, but on unrelated warrants. What they didn't yet realize was that he had been sitting in that cell for days, calm, certain that no one would ever find what he'd done. That certainty was about to die. By sunset, the house on the quiet Akron street was ringed with cruisers and floodlights. Reporters gathered behind the tape, their cameras trained on the backyard as the coroner's van arrived. The neighbors watched from porches, whispering the same question. How could something like this happen here? Kim didn't stay for the removal. She couldn't. She sat in her car with her head against the steering wheel, listening to the muffled voices behind glass, remembering every time police had told her to give a few more days. She remembered walking up these same steps, banging on the door, hearing a faint noise inside, and being told it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was him. Inside the evidence tent, the forensics team worked in silence. One of them lifted a small object from the ashes, a piece of a wooden handle, charred, splintered at the end. Another pulled a melted section of rope, still knotted. Everything pointed to a killing that had started inside the house and ended here in the dirt. Detectives gathered in the kitchen to brief the supervisor. The air smelled of smoke and decay. Empty Pepsi cans lined the counter. The kind Martha used to drink constantly, according to her daughter. There hadn't been any left in the fridge the first time officers checked the house. That, Kim had said, was the first sign her mother was gone. She'd been right about everything. By the time the body was formally identified, the story had already broken. Missing woman found buried in boyfriend's yard. But the headline left out everything that mattered. The weeks of warnings, the calls for help that went nowhere, the daughter who refused to stop asking questions. For Kim, justice was a relief. It was confirmation of the nightmare she'd been living for a month. For detectives, it was a reckoning. A reminder of every small decision that had led them here. Every assumption, every moment of doubt, every time they'd turned away. And for David Callahan, sitting in a cell at the county jail, it was the beginning of the end. Because by morning, investigators would be standing over him with photographs of the backyard, the ashes, and the rope. And they would ask him a question that could no longer be ignored. "Are you a heartless bastard, David?" He would say no. He would cry. And then he would tell them exactly what he had done. To understand how this moment came to be, how a woman's plea for help was lost in a maze of disbelief, we have to go back to the call that started it all. 30 days before the discovery in that Akron backyard, a police dispatcher picked up a call from a familiar number. The voice on the other end trembled, shifting between pleading and incoherence. "I need to reinstate a restraining order. He's supposed to go, went down the first path, wasn't supposed to be out." It was Martha Robin Freitag, 53, living on the east side of Akron with her longtime boyfriend, David Callahan. To the officers who'd handled her before, the name barely raised an eyebrow. Martha was known for her mental health struggles, schizophrenia, erratic behavior, frequent calls about domestic disputes that never quite made sense. Most nights, her calls ended the same way: a welfare check, a few reassurances, and another note in the system. That Monday morning, patrol officers were dispatched again. They didn't hurry. When they arrived, Martha was standing outside the small white house in a rain-stained T-shirt, clutching a stack of papers. Her voice wavered as she tried to explain, but her words tangled into fragments, the kind of rambling that made officers glance at each other and quietly decide she wasn't making sense. "I got a restraining order against him, and then, I don't know what are you doing over there?" "I'm talking to you." "Why are you over there like that?" "Because I want to be." From the porch, David Callahan watched in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, arms crossed, expression blank, until the officers turned back toward their cruiser. They noted that Martha seemed confused but calm, that no immediate crime was evident, and that both parties would work things out. Then they drove away. What the officers didn't realize was that the woman they'd just left behind had less than an hour to live. Inside the house, tension curdled into something darker. David was furious. He had told her never to call the police again. He had told her he'd make sure no one ever found her if she did. Neighbors later said they heard nothing that afternoon. No screaming, no struggle. Only the sound of wind chimes and a dog barking somewhere down the street. But inside those walls, Martha's final moments were brutal. David grabbed a wooden axe handle from beside the bed. One heavy blow to the head sent her crumpling to the floor. When she tried to move, he wrapped a rope around her neck and pulled until she stopped breathing. There was no pause, no remorse, only silence. Hours passed before he moved her body. When darkness fell, he dragged her outside, sealed her in a plastic bag, and set her on fire. The smell carried faintly through the neighborhood. That strange, chemical scent people would later remember but dismiss at the time. Then he buried her under the ash, covered the pit with dirt, and went back inside. By dawn, there was no trace of Martha except for the faint soot rising from the fire pit. For the next several days, David played the role of the aggrieved boyfriend. He told neighbors they had split up again, that she was staying with another man. He even answered her phone once or twice, pretending to be her. Short texts, clipped sentences, just enough to keep suspicion away. To most people, Martha's disappearance didn't seem unusual. She'd vanished before, sometimes for weeks, checking into hospitals or shelters when her paranoia worsened. But this time, something was different. She didn't contact her daughter. Kim noticed the silence immediately. Martha called her almost every day, sometimes several times a day. Then suddenly, nothing. No texts, no voicemails, no late-night rambling about David. Just quiet. At first, Kim tried to stay calm. Maybe her mother had checked herself into treatment again. Maybe her phone was broken. But after 3 days, she started calling hospitals, shelters, jails, anywhere that might have her name on record. No one did. By the 5th day, dread had settled into her chest like a stone. Kim got in her car and drove to her mother's house. The house looked wrong from the start. Curtains drawn, mail piling on the steps, the air heavy with that strange burnt smell that clung faintly to the soil. Kim knocked until her knuckles turned red. No answer. She peered through the window. The furniture looked the same, but the usual clutter, her mother's shoes, the soda can she left everywhere, was gone. It felt empty, staged. That's when Kim called the police. When the responding officer arrived, Kim met in the yard, voice shaking. Nobody's heard from her. She was having a lot of problems with her boyfriend. He's made death threats to her. Said he was going to make sure nobody ever found her. The officer nodded, writing notes in his pad, but his tone stayed neutral, almost bored. He mentioned that Martha had a history of paranoia, that she'd often gone missing before. He told Kim they'd check, but not to expect much. A faint noise came from inside the house. A creak, maybe a footstep. The officer looked toward the door, then away again. You don't have a key to her place? No. All right. Well, we can't force entry yet. He explained the rules. How adults with mental illness were still free to disappear if they chose. How hospitals couldn't release information without consent. He told Kim to wait a few days before filing a missing person report. Then he left. What Kim didn't know was that the sound she'd heard wasn't her imagination. It was David, standing motionless behind the door, waiting for police to go away. That decision to walk away, to wait, would shape everything that came next. Without a formal report, no case file was opened, no notes were added to the system. When another pair of officers came days later, they saw nothing on record, assumed Martha had been found and left again. David, meanwhile, used the time to clean, burn, and cover what he'd done. For him, the murder was over. For Kim, it was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Kim's persistence became the only reason anyone remembered Martha's name. She called the station daily, left voicemails, asked to speak to detectives. When they brushed her off, she began doing the work herself, tracking David's movements, printing flyers, driving to his workplace. One by one, people started confirming what she already feared. David was still around, but Martha was not. 3 weeks after that last call, she finally convinced police to come back. The search that day turned up nothing, at least nothing obvious. But Kim saw details the officers missed. No shoes by the door, no Pepsi in the fridge, the scent of burned plastic wafting through the yard. When she tried to tell them, they shrugged it off. One officer even joked, "First sign of distress is that there's no Pepsi in that fridge." Kim stared at him, silent. She knew then she was alone. As days turned into weeks, David's confidence grew. He roamed at night, careful but unbothered. He texted from Martha's phone short, robotic messages. "I'm fine. I'm with friends." He had no idea that his own carelessness, a text to the wrong person, a rumor shared in the wrong ear, would soon bring it all crashing down. But for now, Martha was just another missing woman, and David Callahan was a man no one looked twice at. And somewhere beneath the dirt behind that house, her body waited for someone to believe. The official record said nothing had happened. No missing person report, no forced entry, no sign of distress. But Kim Freitag knew better. She could feel it, the way only a daughter can when something sacred in the universe goes suddenly, irreversibly wrong. For weeks, she refused to let silence be the last word. Every morning, Kim called her mother's phone. Sometimes it rang once before going to voicemail. Other times it went straight to a robotic voice. "The number you've dialed is not available." She left messages anyway. "Please, really. Mom, it's me. Please call back. I'm worried." By the second week, the mailbox was full. She began driving past her mother's house daily. parking a few houses down and watching the windows. No lights, no movement, except sometimes, late at night, a faint flicker through the blinds. Once, she thought she saw a shadow cross the hallway. She wrote the time down in a notebook, as if collecting evidence for a case no one else wanted to open. When the police grew tired of her calls, Kim started printing flyers. Martha's smiling face, eyes bright, hair brushed back, stared from every telephone pole in the neighborhood. Missing since July. People glanced, then looked away. In this part of town, missing persons came and went like the weather. Still, Kim kept pushing. She visited the station again and again, each time meeting a new officer who'd skim the old notes and say the same thing. She's an adult, ma'am. She can choose to disappear. But she didn't choose this, Kim would insist. They'd nod politely, the kind of nod that ends a conversation. Then, one afternoon, a message arrived on her phone, a single line from her mother's number. "I'm fine. I'm busy with friends." The relief lasted 5 seconds. Then the dread came back stronger. The words didn't sound like Martha. Her mother's texts were always filled with ellipses, random capital letters, affectionate sign-offs. This message was short, cold, typed by someone imitating familiarity, but missing the rhythm of it. Kim replied instantly, "Where are you? I'll come get you." A minute later, "I'm eating now." Then nothing. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. Whoever was sending those messages was trying to make her stop looking. She didn't. Kim drove straight to the police station again. This time, she didn't beg. She demanded, "Someone is using her phone. I want the house checked again." The officer on duty hesitated, scanning the log. The system showed no active report. The last visit was weeks earlier. Cleared, no follow-up required. He sighed. "All right, we'll send someone out." When the cruiser pulled up to the familiar little house, Kim was already waiting in the driveway. The air smelled of cut grass and something faintly sour, like smoke trapped in soil. 2 officers stepped out, both new to the case. They hadn't read the earlier notes, didn't know the history. To them, this was just another welfare check. Kim's voice trembled as she led them to the porch. "She's not answering. Her shoes are gone. Her things are gone. Please, just open the door." One officer knocked. Silence. He exchanged a look with his partner, the universal glance that says, "This is nothing." "Well, if she owns a property, we can't force entry without probable cause. It's not a crime for an adult to be missing. I have power of attorney." Kim snapped. "I'm giving you permission." "We still need confirmation," he said gently. "You understand." The conversation circled in useless loops until Kim's voice broke. "She told me, if I go missing, it's no accident. She said that to me and to my grandmother. He told her no one would ever find her." The officers paused, uneasy but unmoved. Finally, one offered a compromise. "If you file the report officially, we'll document it. But it'll be vague until we have something concrete." Kim signed the form right there on the hood of the cruiser, her handwriting jagged from fury. Inside the house, the officers saw what looked like normalcy. No overturned furniture, no blood, no shattered glass. But to Kim, everything screamed wrong. No Pepsi cans, no shoes by the door, no half-folded laundry on the couch. Her mother lived in clutter. This was a showroom, a stage set for someone pretending everything was fine. "Nothing looks disturbed," one officer said. "Maybe she's just staying somewhere else." "She's not," Kim whispered. "He's cleaned it." When they left, she sat on the curb and stared at the house until dusk. Somewhere inside, behind those curtains, the truth waited, buried in silence and ash. That night, she began digging into David Callahan herself. A background check pulled up a string of old arrests, theft, drug abuse, trespassing, outstanding warrants. He wasn't in jail, at least not yet. She printed the record and brought it to the police the next morning. "You have to find him," she said. "He's dangerous." They promised to follow up. A few days later, they finally did, visiting the place where David sometimes worked odd jobs. Workers there remembered him. "Yeah, we've seen him around. Older guy, gray hair, rough look, Couple days ago, maybe. So he was still out there, still close. But even that lead fizzled. The report went nowhere, buried under routine paperwork. By now, a month had passed since the last confirmed sighting of Martha. Kim's calls grew frantic. Her own voice on voicemail recording started to sound unfamiliar, strained, desperate, cracking under exhaustion. And then came the turning point. An anonymous text from an unknown number. If he was going to get rid of someone, he'd bury them in the backyard. No greeting, no signature. Just that. Kim stared at the words for a long time. Her hands shook as she called 911. Officers met her at the house within the hour. For the first time, they treated it as a potential crime scene. They asked who sent the message. She couldn't say. Maybe someone who'd overheard David talking. Maybe a conscience finally cracking. Either way, the tip couldn't be ignored. Kim watched as they crossed the yard, flashlights slicing through weeds. One officer pointed to a patch of dirt near the fire pit. "Looks disturbed," he murmured. Another noticed bits of melted fabric mixed with ash. For the first time, the air changed, a collective shift from routine to realization. The quiet acknowledgement that this might be exactly what Kim had been saying all along. She stood motionless as they began to dig. A neighbor peered over the fence, covering his mouth. The smell that rose from the soil was thick and chemical, the same odor people had noticed weeks before, but never questioned. Within minutes, a gloved hand brushed against something that wasn't dirt, a corner of plastic, then another, then what looked like a human joint. One officer turned pale. "Stop," he whispered. Another called for the coroner. Kim didn't need confirmation. She already knew. Her mother had been here all along. That night, the backyard glowed under floodlights and camera flashes. Detectives swarmed the property. A coroner's van idled at the curb. Reporters gathered like vultures, murmuring questions about domestic violence, mental illness, police negligence. But Kim heard none of it. She stood by the yellow tape, numb, as an officer told her gently that they couldn't say yet whose remains were found. She nodded, though her body was shaking. In her mind, she could still hear her mother's voice. "If I go missing, it's no accident." It wasn't. And now, finally, the world would have to believe her. When the shovels hit bone in that Akron backyard, David Callahan was sitting in the county jail, calm, silent, unaware that his backyard secret was unraveling piece by piece. He had been arrested days earlier on unrelated warrants: minor theft, contempt of court, and probation violation. It wasn't justice, not yet, just coincidence. Detectives didn't even know, when they first brought him in, that Martha's remains were buried behind his house. They just knew the name David Callahan kept showing up, the boyfriend of the past, the man Martha's daughter swore had killed her. When detectives entered the holding room that morning, David looked up with a faint, practiced smile. His posture was relaxed. "What's this about?" "We're just checking in," one detective said. "You've been mentioned in a missing person case." David chuckled, a small, disbelieving laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, that again." He leaned back in his chair and began to talk, the way seasoned liars always do, casually, warmly, like they're helping. He said he and Martha had been together for years but had drifted apart. He said she was schizophrenic, off her medication, seeing another man. He said she had probably left to clear her head. "Her family's always treated her bad," he added, shaking his head. "Wouldn't surprise me if she cut them off again. They're always fighting." He didn't know the officers had already heard that same excuse before, from him, to neighbors, to anyone who asked where Martha was. The detectives let him talk, taking notes quietly. They weren't ready to accuse him yet. But something about his tone made them uneasy, that steady calm, that easy pivot to blaming Martha's illness. Behind the mirror, another detective watched the footage. He'd seen that pattern before, men who learn how to hide behind their partner's diagnosis. When victims were labeled unstable, every cry for help became a symptom, every bruise a delusion. David had played that role perfectly, and for a while it worked. When police first visited the house a month earlier, they'd left Martha standing outside, rambling incoherently while David stood calmly in the doorway. He knew exactly how to appear, Cooperative, steady, rational. The officer's eyes followed the calm one, the quiet one, the man who looked normal. The woman trembling in the yard just seemed off. That's how predators like David survive, by letting the victim discredit herself. As the interrogation went on, David's confidence grew. He thought he was winning. When detectives asked if he knew Martha's daughter, he rolled his eyes. Kim? She's crazy. Always hated me. Thinks I'm the reason her mom's sick. When they told him Kim hadn't heard from her mother in a month, he shrugged. That's on them. Family drama. She's fine. Probably down in Florida with that new guy. His composure only faltered once, when a detective mentioned Facebook messages. She talked to people on Messenger, right? The detective asked casually. David's eyes flickered. It lasted a fraction of a second, but the room changed temperature. The air thickened with the weight of something unspoken, because Martha's daughter had already told police that her mother's account had been active long after she disappeared. Someone had been sending messages, short, out-of-character replies that sounded nothing like her. The detective leaned forward. That you messaging her friends, David? What? No, he said quickly. I don't even know her password. You sure? We found her phone. That was a lie, a strategic one. David's jaw tightened. The interrogators knew the psychology of silence. They let the seconds stretch until David fidgeted, rubbed his forehead, exhaled. He was trying to decide whether they were bluffing. Then came the push. We got her checks too, one detective said softly. Ones you cashed after she went missing. That landed. David blinked, then laughed, that defensive, high-pitched laugh that always gives guilt away. Oh, come on, you think I'd? No. She told me to cash those. The detective folded his hands. Then where is she? David's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the floor. I don't know. While that game played out downtown, another team was back at the house. They'd been authorized to dig deeper, literally. The anonymous message had given them probable cause, and now that David was in custody, they could search without interference. It didn't take long. A neighbor had stepped forward with a new detail. The night after Martha vanished, he'd seen flames rising from David's yard and smelled something terrible. Like burnt meat, he said quietly. Not trash. Something worse. That was enough. Fire crews arrived to assist forensic teams. By late afternoon, they uncovered the charred remains wrapped in plastic. When the first bones surfaced, the lead officer's voice cracked over the radio. Pretty positive at the body buried under the fire pit. News traveled fast. Within hours, the detectives facing David knew exactly what was in that pit and what it meant. When they re-entered the interrogation room, everything changed. Gone was the polite tone, the measured questioning. This time, they sat closer. Their voices dropped low. Dave, you're in deep, one said. We found her in your yard. For the first time, David didn't speak. His eyes darted from face to face. That's not possible, he whispered. You want to tell us what happened before we do? I don't, he swallowed. I didn't mean to. The room went still. Detectives leaned in. You mean to what, Dave? He rubbed his temples. It just happened. You hit her. A nod, almost imperceptible. With what? He hesitated. Then, an axe handle. She kept yelling. I lost it. His words came out trembling, almost rehearsed, as if he'd imagined this confession many times, waiting for the moment he'd finally have to say it aloud. Then what? I burned her. I didn't know what else to do. He wiped at his eyes, but no tears came, only sweat. Later, when they played back the tape, that was the line that stayed with the detectives most. I didn't know what else to do. Because that was the moment his lies collapsed, not out of guilt, but inevitability. He'd been cornered by evidence, by arrogance, by the quiet persistence of a daughter who refused to stop. And in that corner, David Callahan became what he'd always been. Small, cowardly, predictable. He would tell the rest in fragments. The argument, the strike, the rope, the way he waited until dark, drag her outside, watch the flames. He said he snapped. He said he loved her. He said she wouldn't stop yelling. When the confession ended, one detective turned off the recorder. Another slid the chair back, staring at the man across from him. "You know, David," he said quietly, "if we'd listened to her daughter sooner, maybe you wouldn't be sitting here right now." David didn't answer. He stared at the wall, jaw tight, eyes glazed. For the first time, he looked like the thing he'd been all along. Not the calm man behind the door, not the patient boyfriend, but the killer beneath the mask. Outside the room, a detective whispered to another, "You think he ever felt sorry?" "No," came the reply. "Just caught." That night, they booked him on charges of murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, while the family he'd torn apart would spend theirs piecing together what the system ignored. But there was one more truth left to face, one that went beyond David. Because this case wasn't just about a killer. It was about what happens when warning signs are dismissed, when mental illness becomes an excuse to stop listening, and when a daughter's voice isn't enough to save a mother. For most people, a confession marks the end of the story. For Martha Freitag's family, it was only the beginning of understanding just how many chances there had been to save her. When the news broke that David Callahan had confessed to murder, Akron's local outlets covered it like another headline in a long list of domestic tragedies. Boyfriend admits to killing missing woman. The words were simple, sterile, stripped of the chaos and disbelief that had consumed the last month of Kim's life. There were no headlines for phone calls ignored, the reports never filed, the officers who'd walked away from the house while her mother's killer watched from behind the curtains. Kim couldn't sleep after the body was found. She replayed everything in her head. Every moment the system told her to wait. Every time someone used the word unstable to explain away her mother's fear. Because that's what Martha had been reduced to in those final weeks. A diagnosis. Not a person, not a victim, but a mentally ill woman with a history of false alarms. And that label had killed her long before David ever did. At the station, the detective sat through internal reviews. Every officer who'd had contact with Martha before her death was required to submit statements, each one a list of procedural justifications, legal technicalities, and hindsight rationalizations. One report noted, subject appeared disorganized, no visible injuries, no probable cause for arrest or detainment. Another, frequent caller, known to exaggerate domestic incidents. Each sentence built a wall between responsibility and regret. When the department released an official statement, it was short. The Akron Police Department expresses condolences to the family of Ms. Freitag and is reviewing all procedures related to mental health response and welfare checks. To the public, it sounded responsible. To Kim, it sounded hollow. The truth was simple. Martha had begged for help, and help never came. 2 weeks before her murder, she called police asking to reinstate a restraining order. The very day officers dismissed her as incoherent. She'd been trying to protect herself. She just couldn't express it in the calm, linear way the system required. Her schizophrenia made her voice tremble, her sentences wander. But buried inside that confusion was clarity. He's going to get me, and nobody will ever find me. The words were there. They just weren't believed. The community's response split in two. Some blamed the police for negligence. Others blamed the mental health system that let Martha slip through the cracks. A few called it fate, an inevitable tragedy in a broken world. But those closest to the case knew better. They saw the chain reaction of small choices that led to her death. A dispatcher marking a call as routine. An officer deciding not to file a report. A detective assuming a woman with schizophrenia must be exaggerating. Each step logical on its own, and deadly when combined. In internal memos later leaked to local reporters, one investigator wrote bluntly, had a missing person report been filed during the first welfare check, follow-up protocols would have been mandatory. Subsequent visits would not have been cleared as resolved. That single missing document, a report never written, was a thin line between a chance to intervene and a month of silence while a murderer hid in plain sight. David Callahan's confession didn't come from remorse. It came from exhaustion. In the recorded interview, his voice cracked not with guilt, but with self-pity. "I just snapped," he said. She wouldn't stop yelling. He described the act with clinical detachment, pausing only to insist that he hadn't planned it. He admitted to burning her body, to tying the rope, to cashing her checks after her death, all the while shaking his head, repeating, "I didn't mean to." When detectives played the footage later, one noted quietly, "He's more upset about being caught than about what he did." In court, prosecutors used his own words as the spine of their case. They showed photographs of the backyard, the ashes, the melted plastic fused bedding, the charred axe handle. The jury didn't flinch. David's defense claimed diminished responsibility, citing drug use and mental strain. The argument failed. Within days, the verdict was in guilty on all charges: murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence. His sentence, life in prison. But for Kim, closure was a myth. Justice didn't bring her mother back, and it didn't erase the knowledge that Martha had died believing no one would help her. After the trial, Kim stood on her porch and spoke softly to reporters. "I begged them. I told them he'd kill her. They told me to wait." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't rise in anger. It just hovered there, steady, exhausted, final. The clip aired on local news that night, then disappeared into the churn of daily headlines. In the month that followed, Martha's story became a quiet case study for reform. Advocates pushed for new policies on domestic calls involving mental illness, for training that would teach officers to hear the truth even when it came out fragmented, for protocols that would force documentation regardless of perceived credibility. Some changes were made. Others were buried in budget meetings and paperwork. But among those who remembered her, the lesson was painfully clear. The cost of disbelief is always measured in hindsight. Back at the house on Fulton Street, the backyard was eventually filled in. The police tape came down, the fire pit dismantled. The property went up for sale, the listing stripped of its past. But neighbors said they still smelled smoke when the wind shifted, that faint, chemical tang of something burned long ago, but never gone. Kim never returned. She couldn't. She kept one thing from the house, a small, charred piece of glass from a Pepsi bottle, the last trace of her mother's habits, something human to hold on to. It sits on her dresser now, next to a framed photo of Martha smiling at a picnic table years before David entered her life. Sometimes, when she can't sleep, Kim presses a glass to her palm and whispers, "They know now, Mom." They finally know. But knowing doesn't heal. It only illuminates what was ignored. The ashes of neglect are not easily scattered. They settle in the corners of memory. In every unanswered call, every form unfiled, every sigh of disbelief when a frightened woman tries to explain that she's in danger. In those ashes lies a question no one in Akron can fully answer. How many warnings does a life have to give before it's heard? Long after the headlines faded, after the reporters packed their vans and the yellow tape came down, the little house on Fulton Street sat empty. The weeds grew back first, thick and wild, curling over the patch of earth where the fire pit once stood. The neighbors stopped talking about it, though they still crossed the street when they walked their dogs. And sometimes late at night, when the wind rustled through the trees, they swore they could still smell it, that acrid trace of burned soil and something they couldn't name. Inside the county jail, David Callahan adjusted to silence. No more police interviews. No more stage to perform his calm. He never spoke Martha's name again. In his world, the story was over, the confession filed, the sentence passed. He had transformed her into paperwork. Victim hashtag 2785-23. He thought that was where it ended. But stories like this don't end with the perpetrator. They end with the people who keep remembering. Kim Freitag still lives in Akron. She keeps a small folder in her nightstand. News clippings, court transcripts, her mother's last handwritten note. The edges are soft from being unfolded and refolded so many times. She doesn't look at them often, but when she does, she reads the same line over and over. "If I come up missing or dead, it is no accident." It wasn't a prophecy. It was a warning, a desperate attempt to make the world believe her before it was too late. And no one did. Kim has stopped asking herself why. There are too many answers, each one heavier than the last. A broken system, a string of small dismissals, a bias against voices that tremble. All she knows is that the last words her mother spoke to the police were fragmented, frightened, and ignored. If they had heard what she meant, not what she said, maybe she'd still be alive. The house sold quietly that winter. A young couple bought it, unaware of what the ground beneath them held. They repainted the walls, replaced the porch steps, planted flowers along the fence. But the neighbors noticed something odd. They never stayed long outside after dark. There's a weight to places like that, the kind that lingers even after the evidence is gone. Detectives call it residual trauma. Locals call it something simpler, haunting. Every officer who walked through that house carries their own version of it. The rookie who first met Martha outside that day still remembers her eyes, pleading, scattered, searching for the right words. He admitted later that he dismissed her because she seemed off. He said he thought about it every night after confession came out. She tried to tell us, he said quietly. We just didn't listen right. It wasn't malice that killed Martha. It was indifference, the kind that hides behind procedure, paperwork, and illusion of calm, the kind that sees mental illness as noise instead of signal. In the months that followed, the Akron Police Department quietly adjusted its policies. Domestic calls involving psychiatric conditions would now trigger dual responses: law enforcement and crisis intervention teams. Officers would be retrained to document every welfare check, no matter how trivial it seemed. It was a start, but it came too late for Martha. The file on her case now sits in a gray cabinet, its cover stamped closed. Inside are photos of the backyard, the scorched dirt, the melted plastic, the thin blue rope. On the last page, a single sentence typed by the lead detective: cause of death, blunt force trauma and strangulation. Below it, in pen, a smaller note, probably written during a long night when the room was quiet and the guilt too loud. She was right. Kim doesn't visit her mother's grave often. She says it's not because she doesn't care, but because she can still hear her mother more vividly in the places she once lived. The creak of the old porch, the hum of the refrigerator, the low whistle of the furnace when it kicked on in winter. That's where Martha still exists, not as evidence, but as memory. On the anniversary of her death, Kim leaves a can of Pepsi at the cemetery. It was her mother's favorite. Something small and ordinary, the kind of detail detectives miss when they searched the house and thought everything looked fine. To Kim, that Pepsi can is proof of life, proof that her mother was here, human and imperfect, and worth believing. In the end, the story of Martha Freitag isn't just about murder. It's about the echo left behind when people look away. It's about a voice dismissed as confusion, a daughter forced to become an investigator, a system that learned too late how to listen. Some stories demand justice. This one demands remembrance. Because in every city, on every quiet street, there's another Martha, a person whose fear sounds too frantic, whose words come out wrong, whose danger hides behind disbelief. And every time someone hesitates, another grave like hers waits to be dug. When you strip everything else away, the police reports, the interviews, the courtroom statements, only two things remain: a mother's warning and a daughter's refusal to stop listening. That is a legacy of Martha Robin Freitag, not the horror of her death, but the persistence of the only person who refused to let her vanish into paperwork. And that's what remains.